The wind swept through the endless rows of corn, as if carrying secrets from another world. It was autumn in Kansas, 1878, and the fields were heavy with ripe stalks that swayed like restless spirits. Nathaniel stood at the edge of his family's farm, staring into the golden expanse. His hands trembled not from cold, but from something deeper, a feeling he could not name. He had heard them again last night, whispers threading through the darkness just beyond the reach of lantern light. They called his name softly at first, then louder until it felt like they were inside his head. Nathaniel wasn't alone, though. He wished he was. His three brothers, Jonah, Elias, and Silas, had been acting strangely too. Jonah, who used to laugh loudest, now sat by the fire silent, his eyes hollow. Elias wandered the fields for hours, returning only when the sun dipped below the horizon, and Silas refused to sleep at all, claiming he saw shadows moving where no one stood. Their father had died 2 years ago, leaving them the farm and a legacy of hard work, but lately none of them seemed interested in tending the crops. Soil itself seemed dead, dry, and cracked. Despite weeks of rain, villagers whispered about curses, though no one dared say it aloud. Nathaniel remembered the old man who lived on the outskirts of town, a hermit named Ezra, who claimed to know things others didn't. Tezra had warned their father once about disturbing what lay beneath the earth. Our land holds more than grain, he had said, pointing a crooked finger toward the fields. Bower, the roots that grow too deep. Their father laughed it off, calling Ezra a madman, but Nathaniel thought of those words now as he stared at the darkening sky. Tonight would be different. Tonight he would find out what the whispers wanted, grabbed a lantern, and stepped into the cornfield. She stalks closed around him, muffling the sounds of the outside world. Air grew colder with each step, and the whispers grew louder. Nathaniel stopped suddenly when he saw it, a figure standing still among the swaying stalks. It was Silas, or at least it looked like Silas, but there was something wrong. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. Nathaniel called out, but Silas didn't respond. Instead, he turned slowly and walked further into the field against his better judgment. Nathaniel followed the mark beneath the soil. Deep within the cornfield, Nathaniel stumbled upon a patch of earth. Unlike any other, the ground here was blackened as if scorched by fire. In its center was a crude symbol carved into the dirt. It pulsed faintly as if alive. Nathaniel felt a chill run down his spine as he realized Silas was gone. He knelt beside the mark, tracing its edges with trembling fingers. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping voices speaking in tongues he couldn't understand. Then came the memory, sharp and unbidden. It was his father's voice shouting orders, demanding they dig deep. Earthy had been children, then obedient, and they've at each other. The four brothers unearthed something buried long before their timia. Box made of iron, rusted and ancient. Inside was a mirror, cracked and fogged. Their father took it away, locking it in the attic, but Nathaniel remembered the way it hummed when touched. It reflected not their faces, but something else entirely. At night, after finding the mark, Nathaniel dreamed stood in the attic, surrounded by shadows. Mirror hung before him, though he knew it shouldn't be there. Its surface rippled like water, and from it emerged figures, for men identical to himself and his brothers, yet twisted, distorted. They reached for him, their mouths opening impossibly wide. Then he woke screaming. Room was freezing, and the attic door creaked open on its own. Nathaniel climbed out of bed, his heart pounding, told himself it was just a dream, but the cold air lingering in his room said otherwise. The house was silent, except for the faint sound of footsteps above him, footsteps coming from the attic. His brothers were asleep, or so he thought. Grabbed a lantern and ascended the narrow staircase. Each step groaned under his weight, as if protesting his presence. Attic was dark save for the flickering light of his lantern, and there in the corner sat the mirror, dust covered its surface. But even through the grime, Nathaniel could see movement, shapes shifting behind the glass. Approached cautiously, his breath shallow. Whispers began again, softer this time, almost soothing. The promised answers, promised clarity. Nathaniel reached out his fingers, brushing the mirror's edge, and suddenly the world shifted. Wasn't in the attic anymore. He stood in a vast field under a blood-red sky. Cornstalks around him stretched endlessly, their leaves razor-sharp in the distance. He saw them, his brothers Jonah, Elias, and Silas, but they weren't alone behind them. Loomed shadowy figures, faceless and towering their forms, seemed to stretch and warp, defying logic. Nathaniel tried to call out, but no sound left his lips. The figures turned toward him, their movements jerky, unnatural. Then one of them spoke, not with words, but directly into his mind. "You have awakened us," it said. The voice was neither male nor female, but a chorus of countless others. "Your blood, your bond will feed us." Before Nathaniel could react, the vision shattered, found himself back in the attic, gasping for air. Mirror lay shattered on the floor, its shards glittering like teeth, but worse than that was what he saw in the reflection of the largest shard. His own face stared back at him, except it wasn't his face anymore. It was older, gaunt, with eyes sunken and hollow. Panic surged through him, and he fled the attic, back in his room. He tried to calm himself, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, he heard it again. The whispers, this time clearer, more insistently, called his name over and over until he pressed his hands to his ears. Next morning, Nathaniel avoided his brother. She didn't want to look at them, afraid of what he might see, but avoidance wasn't an option. Jonah appeared at breakfast, his expression unreadable. "You need to talk," he said. "Simply about what happened last night." Nathaniel froze, unsure of what Jonah meanted. He know about the mirror, about the vision. Jonah leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Ellis hasn't been himself lately. Last night I caught him outside wandering near the fields. When I asked him what he was doing, he just stared at me like he didn't recognize me." Nathaniel felt a knot tighten in his stomach, wanted to tell Jonah everything about the mirror, the whispers, the nightmare, but fear held him back. What if Jonah didn't believe him, or worse, what if Jonah already knew later that day? Nathaniel decided to confront Silas, found him in the barn, staring blankly at the wall. Silas turned slowly, as if sensing Nathaniel's presence. His eyes were distant, unfocused. "You remember the box?" Silas asked, abrupt, lithe question caught Nathaniel off guard. "Of course I remember, but why are you asking, Becca's it still here?" Silas whispered. "Not the box, whatever was inside it never left." Nathaniel opened his mouth to respond, but Silas cut him off. "You saw it too, didn't you? Figures in the mirror, ones that look like us." Nathaniel nodded reluctantly. Silas smiled, but it wasn't a smile of relief. It was something darker, colder. "They waiting for us," he said, "and soon they'll take us." Before Nathaniel could ask what he meant, Silas walked away, leaving him alone in the barn. Air felt heavier, somehow suffocating. And then Nathaniel noticed something on the floor, a single shard of glass glinting faintly in the dim light. Bent down to pick it open as his fingers closed around it. Whispers returned louder than ever. The shard of glass burned in Nathaniel's hand, though it left no mark. It dropped it instinctively, but the whispers didn't stop. They filled the barn, wrapping around him like a suffocating fog. "You cannot escape," they hissed. "Your bond is your curse." Nathaniel stumbled back, clutching his ears, but the voices weren't coming from outside. They were inside his head. Memories flooded back, unbidden and unwelcome memories of that day when they were children, digging in the fields under their father's order show, excited they had been to find something hidden, something secret. Box had seemed harmless at first, its rusted surface cool to the touch, but when their father opened it, everything changed. The mirror inside hummed like a living thing, and for a brief moment Nathaniel saw not his reflection but a stranger staring back, a face twisted with rage and hunger. Their father slammed the lid shut and locked it away, but the damage was done. From that day forward, things began to unravel. Small things at first: lost tools, misplaced belongings, strange noises. At night came the dreams, vivid, horrifying dreams, where the four brothers stood together, but not as themselves, as shadows, faceless and hollow. Nathaniel shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts needed answers, and there was only one person who might have them. Ezra, the hermit who lived on the outskirts of town. Ezra's cabin was a crumbling relic surrounded by overgrown weeds. It leaned precariously as if ready to collapse. Nathaniel knocked hesitantly. The door creaked open, revealing Ezra himself. His eyes were sharp despite his age, and they bore into Nathaniel like knives. "I've been expecting you," Ezra said, without preamble. His voice was dry, raspy, like dead leaves scraping against stone. "You've come about the mark, haven't you?" Nathaniel nodded, too stunned to speak. Ezra gestured for him to enter inside. The cabin was dimly lit by a single oil lamp. Walls were covered in strange symbols. Etched into the wooden table lay an open book, its pages yellowed and brittly disturbed. Something that should have remained buried. Ezra Sadist's tone wasn't accusatory, but curious. If he had seen this play out countless times before. What did we disturb? Nathaniel asked, finally finding his voice. Ezra turned to face him. Full of mirror was a gateway. Ezra explained it. Just any gateway, but one tied to your bloodline. Your ancestors made a pact long ago, a deal with forces beyond comprehension. In exchange for prosperity, they bound themselves to these entities, feeding them through sacrifice. Athene felt sick. Sacrifice? What kind of sacrifice? Ezra's gaze hardened. The kind that demands more than crops or livestock, kind that takes life itself for. Nathaniel could respond. Ezra continued, mirror reflects not just your imagine but your soul, now it has awakened that it seeks completion. Nathaniel echo eddies. Ezra said grimly, it will use you and your brothers to fulfill the pact. Nathaniel left the cabin shaken. Ezra's words echoed in his mind. Wanted to dismiss them as the ramblings of a madman, but deep down he knew they were truth. Mirror, the whispers, the visions, all of it pointed to something ancient and malevolent. When he returned home, the house was eerily quiet. Jonah, Elias, and Silas sat in the kitchen, their faces pale and drawn. We to talk. Jonah Sadis, voice trembling. Nathani braced himself. What is it? Silas spoke first. He saw them again last night. Figures in the mirror. They weren't just watching us, they were reaching out. Elias nodded slowly. He dreamed of them too, but it wasn't a dream. It was really. Could feel their hands on me, pulling me toward the Murrow. Nathaniel swallowed hard. We need to destroy it, he said firmly. If Ezra is right, then keeping it here is dangerous. Can't let it take you. Us. Jonah laughed bitter. Lion, how do you propose we destroy it? Fire hammer bullets. None of it worked before. Ado, you think we're the first to try? Nathaniel clenched his fists. There has to be a way. Ezra mentioned a ritual, something to sever the connection. Silas stood abruptly. No, he snapped. We're not doing anything. Mirror chose us for a reason. Maybe it's better to let it take use than fight. If room fell silent. Nathaniel stared at his brother. Was this really Silas speaking, or something else wearing his facet? That night, Nathaniel couldn't sleep, lay awake listening to the whispers. They grew louder, more insistent, until he could no longer bear. I crept downstairs, determined to confront the mirror. The attic was darker than ever, the air thick with dread. Shards of the mirror still lay scattered across the floriac piece, glinting faintly as if alive. Nathaniel approached cautiously, and then he saw Ithis' reflection, but it wasn't him. Figure in the shard grinned maliciously, its mouth stretching impossibly wide. Welcome home, it whispered. Nathani backed away, but the reflection stepped out of the shard, silhouette and reeled, lunged at him, and everything went black. House that breathes. Nathani woke to the sound of breathing. It wasn't his own. Air was heavy, pressing down on him like a wave. Opened his eyes slowly and found himself lying on the attic floor. The shards of the mirror surrounded him, glinting faintly in the dim light, but something was wrong. The room felt alive. Walls seemed to pulse as if the house itself had a heartbeat. Nathani tried to sit up, but his body felt sluggish, unresponsive. His reflection from earlier stood across the room, its face twisted into a grotesque grin. You shouldn't have come here, it said, its voice a chorus of whispers overlapping and discordant. Nathani scrambled backward, his hands scraping against the rough wooden floor. What are you? He demanded. The figure tilted its head mockingly. And you, replied, or rather what you will become when the pact is fulfilled. Bore Nathaniel could react. The figure lunged at him, its movements jerky, unnatural, rolled aside, narrowly avoiding its grasp. Impact shook the attic, sending dust cascading from the ceiling. Nathaniel stumbled to his feet, and Ramp House seemed to shift around him. Hallways stretched longer than they. Shoulders appeared where none had been before. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the corridors. They weren't just coming from the mirror anymore, they were everywhere. Nathani reached the staircase leading downstairs, but when he looked back, he saw his brothers, Jonah, Elias, and Silas, standing at the top of the stairs, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes hollow like marbles. Come back, Nathaniel. Jonah, Coletta's voice flat, devoid of emotion. Nathaniel Froze torn between fear and confusion. Was this real, or another trick of the mirror? Aurelius stepped forward, his movements stiff, mechanical. Can't escape. Silas Whisperetta's tone resigned, almost mournful. Mirror has already claimed us. No. Nathaniel Schutetti won't let it take me. He turned and bolted down the stairs. House groaned around him, as if protesting his defiantia. Whispers became screams, piercing his ears, covered them with his hands. But the noise only grew louder in the kitchen. He grabbed a knife from the counter, desperation driving him now. If the mirror couldn't be destroyed, then maybe he could fight whatever it sent after him. Heard footsteps behind him, and spun around. Silas stood in the doorway, but it wasn't. Silas's brother's face was stretched thin like wax, melting under. His mouth split impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. You cannot run forever, he hissed, his voice no longer humanthe. Mirror hungers. Nathaniel swung the knife wildly. Silas dodged easily, his movements fluid, despite his monstrous appearance. Reached out, grabbing Nathaniel by the throat. World blurred as Nathaniel struggled for breath, and everything went dark when he came to. He was outside a cornfield stretched endlessly around him. Sky above was blood-red, and there in the distance stood the four figurist ones from his vision. They beckoned to him silently. Nathan tried to move, but his legs wouldn't obey. The ground beneath him began to crack. Black tendrils snaked up his ankles, pulling him downward. Screamed, but no sound left his lips. The figures approached, their forms shifting and warping. Until they resembled his brothers. Join us, they said in unison, their voices overlapping like a choir complete. The sickly Nathaniel fought against the pull of the earth, but it was futile. Black tendrils tightened, dragging him deeper until only his head remained above ground. His brothers loomed over him, their faces impassive masks of sorrow. It doesn't have to end like this, Jonah said, his voice softer now, tinged with regret. We can still stop it thou. Nathaniel choked out, ears streaming down his face. Silas knelt beside him. Place your hand on the mark. Break the bond. What bond? Nathaniel asked. Bond that ties us to the mirror, Elias replied. Our blood, our sacrifice. If one of us dies willingly, the others may live. Nathaniel stared at them, realization sinking in. Only of us has to die, as Jonah said. It should be you. You're the strong guest, the only one who can break free. Nathaniel hesitated, thought of death. Him, but so did the alternative. Mirror would consume them, alternating them into monsters. Nodded. Finalito it, he whispered at his brothers. Exchanged somber glances, then together they placed their hands on his chest, pushing him fully into the earth. World dissolved into darkness, and Nathaniel felt nothing. The truth beneath the surface. Darkness was absolute. Nathani floated in it, weightless, and none. Time had no meaning. Heresican stretched into hours or maybe days, couldn't tell. But then came the light. It started as a faint glow in the distance, pulsing like a heartbeat, drawing him closer. Reached out, though he had no body to move, and the glow enveloped him. He was standing in the cornfield again, but something was different. The stalks were taller, denser, their leaves sharp enough to cut the sky above was an unnatural shade of crimson, and the air smelled of earth and decay. In the center of the field stood the mirror wall once more, its surface rippling like water. Nathaniel approached cautiously. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't his face. It was older, gaunt, with eyes that burned like embers. You shouldn't have come. It said, its voice a cacophony of whispers. This is not your place. Nathaniel ignored. I'd had questions, and somehow he knew the mirror held the answers. Why, as he demanded, we our familith reflection smirked. Your bloodline was chosen long ago. Your ancestors made a deal, prosperity in exchange for sacrifice, but they broke the pact, left you to pay the price. Nathaniel shook his head. No, we didn't ask for this, we didn't choose. The choices are irrelevant, the reflection replied. Cold. Life bond was forged before you were born, and now it must be fulfilled. How? Nathaniel asked. What does it want from us? Reflection leaned closer, its expression twisting into something grotesque. It wants your soul for of you to complete the cycle. Nathaniel felt a surge of anger and fear. One of us dies willingly, will it stop? He asked. Reflection hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing its face. Perhaps it admit, but the cost will be high. If living will carry the burden forever bore. Nathaniel could respond. The ground beneath him began to tremble. Mirror cracked, splintering into shards, each piece floating upward. Like leaves caught in a storm, the whispers returned. Louder than ever, overlapping voices screaming in agony. Nathaniel fell to his knees, clutching his head. Pain was unbearable. Images flashed before his eyes, brothers lying lifeless in the field, their faces frozen in terror, the mirror consuming them. Holothan came silence when Nathaniel opened his eyes. He was back in the attic. Mirror lay shattered on the floor, its pieces dark and lifeless, but the house was still alive, breathing. Around him, Jonah, Elias, and Silas stood in the doorway, their expressions unreadable. Did it work? Jonah asked quietly. Nathaniel nodded, though he wasn't sure the mirror was gone, but the bond remained. What now? Elias whispered. Matheny looked at them, his heart heavy with guilt. We live, he said simply, but we never forget. Silas stepped forward, his face pale but determined. He'll take the blame, he said. Tell the villagers I destroyed it. They won't understand the truth. Nathaniel wanted to argue, but deep down he knew Silas was right. The world wasn't ready for what they had faced. Some secrets were better left buried. Next morning, the villagers found Silas wandering the fields, his clothes torn, his face streaked with dirt. Claimed to have destroyed the mirror. He refused to say how. Villagers believed him grateful for the end of the strange occurrence, but Nathaniel, Jonah, and Elias knew the truth. Silas had sacrificed himself to sever the bondman's past, and life returned to normaler. So it seemed, but Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, waiting. Gone night, he woke to find the attic door open, shards of the mirror glinting faintly in the moonlight. Approached cautiously and saw this reflection, but it wasn't alone. Behind him stood Silas, faced it into a grotesque grin. Bond isn't broken, Nathaniel, it's just begun. Nathaniel screamed that, but no sound left his lips. Shards rose into the air, forming the mirror once more, its surface rippling like water, and then it pulled him in. The eternal cycle. Nathaniel fell through darkness, endless and suffocating. Whispers surrounded him, a storm of voices overlapping and screaming. He tried to cover his ears, but his hands passed through nothing. There was no body, no form, just the void. Then came the light, faint at first, like a distant stare. It grew brighter until it consumed him, and he found himself standing in the cornfield again, but this time it wasn't empty. His brothers Jonah, Elias, and Silas stood before him, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes glowing faintly like embers. Behind them loomed shadowy figures, faceless and towering, their forms shifting unnatural. Come back, Nathaniel, Silas said, his voice cold and detached. You've returned to complete the cycle. What cycle? Nathaniel asked, his voice trembling. Silas smiled, though it wasn't a smile of kindness. Mirror doesn't destroy, use it binds. Use your blood, our sacrifice. It feeds on us generation after generation. Nathaniel shook his head. No, we broke the bond, we destroyed the mirror. Did we? Silas replied, or did we simply reset? If mirror is not an object, it's a part of you, as a reflection of our souls. Jonah stepped forward, his expression somber. Every generation, one of us must keep the others alive, but even then the bond remains, are tied to it forever. Elias nodded slowly. And now it's your turn, Nathaniel. You were always the strongest, the only one who could break free. Nathaniel felt a surge of panic, but also clarity. Understood now. The mirror wasn't just a curse, it was a prison, a cycle of death and rebirth that would never end. How do I stop it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. You can't, Silas said. The bond is eternal, but you can choose a who's. What? Nathaniel demanded. Silas gestured toward the mirror, which now stood whole once more, its surface rippling like water. You can take my place, become the anchor for the next generation, or you can let the mirror consume us. Nathaniel stared at the mirror, his reflection staring back, but it wasn't him. It was older, gaunt, with eyes that burned like fire. You know what you must do, it whispered at its voice, a chorus of countless others. Nathaniel turned to his brothers, their faces filled with sorrow. They knew what he had to do, but they couldn't bring themselves to say it. I am sorry, Nathaniel said finally, his voice break. Inji didn't want this for any of you. As Jonah placed a hand on his shoulder, you're doing what has to be done. Elias nodded. I'll carry the burden together. Nathaniel approached the mirror, its surface shimmering like liquid glass. He reached out hesitantly, and as his fingers touched it, the world dissolved. When he opened his eyes, he was standing in the attic. Mirror hung before him, wall and unbroken, but something was different. He could feel ith bond was severed, but at a cost. Nathaniel looked at his hands. They were translucent, fading like smoke. His body was gone, replaced by something else, something ancient and malevolent. Villagers would never understand. They would tell stories of the four brothers who disappeared into the fields, leaving behind only whispers and a mark scorched into the earth. Deep beneath the soil, the mirror waited, silent and patient, for the next generation to awaken. So the cycle continued. The end.